It wasn't just a warning. It wasn't just panic. My grandson's words that night saved my life. When family chooses you over silence, over shame, that's when everything changes. If you believe no one listens to grandmas anymore, subscribe to this channel. Here, we tell the stories they wish you never heard. My name is Virginia May Caldwell, but everyone calls me Ginny. I'm 76 years old, and I live in Ohio. Or rather, I used to live in my son's house in Ohio. That's where this story begins, in a place that should have felt like home, but had become something else entirely. For 3 years, I lived under Paul's roof with his wife Samantha and their son Ethan. 3 years of walking on eggshells, of making myself small, of pretending not to notice the looks and the whispers. 3 years of being treated like an inconvenience in my own family. It started gradually, as these things usually do. After my husband Frank passed, I couldn't keep up the mortgage on our old house. Paul insisted I move in with them. "It's temporary, Mom," he said, but we both knew better. The housing market was terrible, my retirement wasn't enough, and at 73, starting over seemed impossible. Samantha smiled when Paul made the offer, but her eyes told a different story. She was polite enough in the beginning, even helpful, but as weeks turned into months, the mask began to slip. "Maggie, could you maybe tidy up the living room?" she'd ask, even though I'd just cleaned it. "The neighbors are coming over and you know how they talk." I did know. I'd lived in small towns my whole life. Appearances mattered, and I was becoming an appearance problem. The worst part wasn't the passive-aggressive comments or the way she'd rearrange everything I organized. It was watching my son, my Paul, who used to call me every Sunday without fail, slowly disappear into silence. He worked longer hours, came home tired, and when conflicts arose between Samantha and me, he'd simply leave the room. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be, Mom," he'd say, as if my mere presence was the source of all difficulty. But Ethan, my grandson Ethan, was different. At 17, he still hugged me when he came home from school. He still asked about my day, still sat with me on the porch swing Frank had built 40 years ago. When Samantha would make her cutting remarks about how I just sat around all day, Ethan would quietly appear with a glass of iced tea and start talking about his classes or his part-time job at the grocery store. He was my lifeline in a house that felt more like a prison every day. I tried to earn my keep, and Lord knows I worked hard at it. Every morning, I'd be up at 5:30 before the rest of the house stirred, making coffee and starting breakfast. I'd learned Paul's preferences over the years. He liked his eggs over easy, his bacon crispy but not burnt, his toast barely golden. Samantha preferred steel-cut oats with fresh berries when they were in season, Greek yogurt with honey when they weren't. I'd set the table with care, using the good placemats Samantha had picked out, making sure the orange juice glasses were spotless and the napkins were folded just right. By the time they came downstairs, a full breakfast would be waiting, the kitchen would be clean, and I'd already have their lunches packed for the day. But somehow, it was never quite right. "Oh, Dot, you didn't need to go to all this trouble," Samantha would say, but her tone suggested the opposite, that perhaps I'd gone to too much trouble, that my efforts were somehow excessive and embarrassing. "The eggs are a little runny today, Mom," Paul might mention, not unkindly, but with the casual dismissal of someone who'd never had to cook for himself. I'd apologize and offer to make new ones, but by then they'd be rushing off to work, leaving me to eat my cooling breakfast alone at the kitchen counter, surrounded by the evidence of my failed hospitality. The afternoons were the worst. After I'd cleaned up from lunch and finished whatever household tasks I could find, there would be long stretches of empty time. I'd tried reading in the living room, but Samantha had a way of making me feel like I was in the way, even when no one else was using the space. "Oh, are you comfortable there, Dot?" she'd ask when she came home from her part-time job at the insurance office. "I was hoping to do some work at the dining table, but the light's better by that window." "Don't mind me, though. You stay put." Of course I'd move. We both knew I would. I'd gather my book and my reading glasses and retreat to my room, where the light was dim and the walls seemed to press closer each day. I started taking long walks around the neighborhood, partly for exercise, but mostly to get out of the house. There's something liberating about being outdoors, about feeling like you have a right to exist in the world. But even those walks became complicated when Samantha started worrying aloud about my safety. "I just think it's dangerous for someone your age to be wandering around alone," she'd say at dinner. "What if you fell? What if you got confused and couldn't find your way home? The neighbors might talk." Always, it came back to the neighbors. What they might think, what they might say, how our family appeared to the outside world. I understood the concern. I really did. Reputation mattered in small communities. But gradually, I realized I was being asked to make myself invisible, not to protect me, but to protect their image of competent adult children who had everything under control. "Oh, Maggie, you didn't need to make so much food," she'd say, looking at the pot roast I'd spent all afternoon preparing. "We're trying to eat lighter these days. Ethan's got that big game coming up." Or she'd find fault with my cleaning. "I think maybe you missed a spot in the bathroom. The guests will be using it tomorrow, so I'll just go over it again real quick." Each comment felt like a tiny pinprick. Individually, they were almost nothing. Together, they formed a pattern of dismissal that wore me down day by day. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October. I'd spent the morning helping organize Samantha's charity auction materials. Hours of sorting and labeling donated items. My arthritis was flaring up something fierce, but I pushed through because I wanted to contribute, to show I was useful. When Paul came home, Samantha was in the kitchen, surrounded by the perfectly organized auction items. "Wow, Sam, this looks incredible," he said, kissing her cheek. "You've really outdone yourself." "Thanks, honey. It took all day, but I think we raised more than last year." I was sitting in the living room just 20 feet away, but I might as well have been invisible. All my work, credited to her without a second thought. It wasn't malicious. That's what made it worse. It was thoughtless, automatic. I had become so insignificant in their lives that my contributions simply didn't register. That night, I lay in the small guest room that had become my world, staring at the ceiling and wondering how I'd become a ghost in my own family. The walls felt like they were closing in, decorated with Samantha's tasteful prints instead of the family photos that used to fill my house. Even the bedspread was hers, a pale blue that washed out my complexion and made me feel sicker than I was. I must have finally fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, someone was knocking softly on my door. I glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. "Grandma?" Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you awake?" I sat up, instantly alert. Ethan never came to my room this late. "Come in, sweetheart. What's wrong?" He slipped inside, closing the door carefully behind him. Even in the dim light from the hallway, I could see he was agitated. His hands were shaking, and he kept glancing back at the door as if someone might follow him. "I need to tell you something," he said, sitting on the edge of my bed. "But you have to promise me you won't get upset." "Not yet." My heart started racing. "Ethan, you're scaring me." "What is it?" He took a deep breath, the kind you take before diving into cold water. "I heard Mom and Dad talking tonight, after you went to bed. They're planning to put you in a nursing home." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd suspected something was wrong, felt the tension building, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. "When?" I managed to ask. "This weekend, while you're at Mrs. Peterson's playing bridge. They're going to move your things and tell you it's already arranged. Mom has been calling places all week." I felt the familiar sting behind my eyes, but I blinked back the tears. I'd cried enough in this house. "I see. There's more." Ethan's voice dropped even lower. "They're planning to say there was some kind of mix-up with your bank accounts, that the nursing home fees got automatically deducted, and by the time they discovered the error, it would be too late to reverse." Now I was truly scared. My bank accounts contained what was left of Frank's life insurance and the small inheritance from my mother. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was my security, my independence. "They can't do that," I whispered. "Can they?" Ethan's expression was grim beyond his years. "Mom has been asking you to sign a lot of papers lately, hasn't she? Financial stuff?" I nodded slowly, remembering. Samantha had indeed been presenting me with various documents over the past few weeks. Insurance forms, she'd said, Medicare paperwork, updates to emergency contacts. I'd signed them all without reading carefully, trusting her explanations. "Oh, Ethan," I breathed. "What have I done? It's not your fault, Grandma. You trusted them because they're family." But he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I've been saving money from my job. It's not much, but it's enough for you to get away from here. Tonight. Tonight? I couldn't process what he was suggesting. But where would I go? I can't just... Yes, you can. His voice was urgent now, filled with a determination I'd never heard before. Remember Mrs. Anderson? From church? She has that little guest house behind her place. I called her yesterday and asked if she'd consider renting it out. She said she'd love the company. Mrs. Anderson. I hadn't spoken to her in months, not since Samantha had started discouraging my church attendance. She doesn't even go to our church anymore, Samantha would say. All those people are such gossips. Gradually, I'd stopped going, stopped seeing my friends, stopped maintaining the connections that had sustained me for decades. Grandma, listen to me. Ethan grabbed my hands, and I could feel how cold his were. They're going to do this whether you fight it or not. The only difference is whether you leave on your own terms or theirs. I looked at my grandson, really looked at him. When had he grown so tall? When had his voice gotten so deep? When had he become wise enough to see what I'd been blind to? You're asking me to run away in the middle of the night, I said, like I've done something wrong. No, his voice was firm. I'm asking you to save yourself. There's a difference. For a long moment, we sat in silence. I could hear the house settling around us, the familiar creaks and sighs of a building I'd never truly called home. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the Ohio countryside, mournful and haunting. If I do this, I said finally, what about you? They'll know you helped me. Ethan shrugged, trying to look casual, but I could see the worry in his eyes. I'll be 18 in 4 months. I can handle whatever they throw at me. And if they cut off your college money, I'll figure it out. Student loans, scholarships, whatever it takes. Grandma, I can't stand by and watch them do this to you. I won't. In that moment, I saw so much of my late husband in Ethan's face. The same stubborn jaw, the same fierce loyalty, the same willingness to do what was right, even when it cost him dearly. How much time do we have? I asked. Relief flooded his features. Dad's working late at the office. Mom took a sleeping pill an hour ago. She'll be out until morning. We can load your things into my car and be gone in 30 minutes. I nodded, surprised by how calm I felt. Maybe this was what clarity looked like. Maybe this was what happened when you stopped fighting the current and finally let it carry you where you needed to go. Give me 10 minutes to pack, I said. Ethan squeezed my hands. Pack light. We can come back for anything important later when they're not here. As he slipped back out of my room, I stood up and looked around at the space that had housed my loneliness for 3 years. The guest room furniture, the generic decorations, the single photo of Frank I'd been allowed to display on the nightstand. None of it was really mine. None of it held memories worth preserving. I dressed quickly in my most comfortable clothes. Dark jeans that wouldn't show dirt, a warm sweater Frank had always said brought out my eyes, sturdy shoes that could handle whatever the night might bring. Then I opened my closet and pulled out the single suitcase I'd arrived with 3 years ago. It looked smaller now somehow, as if it had shrunk during its time in exile. Into it went my most essential clothes, carefully folded to maximize space. My medications went into a separate bag. Blood pressure pills, arthritis medication, the reading glasses I needed for anything smaller than highway signs. Frank's watch, the one his father had given him when he graduated high school, went into the inside pocket where it would be safe. The small wooden box that held my mother's jewelry barely fit, but I made room. Everything else, the books I'd accumulated, the small decorations that had made the guest room feel slightly less sterile, the accumulation of a lifetime, would have to stay. As I folded my clothes, each piece felt like a decision. The blue dress I'd worn to church every Easter for the past decade. Would I need it where I was going? The practical cardigan that had seen me through countless autumn evenings, too bulky for the suitcase, but too useful to leave behind. I found myself making the same calculations refugee women had made throughout history. What to carry, what to abandon, what might be essential for starting over. There was a photograph on my nightstand. Frank and me on our wedding day, both of us so young it was almost shocking. In the picture, I'm wearing my grandmother's pearl necklace and smiling like I know a wonderful secret. Frank looks proud and slightly stunned, as if he can't quite believe his good fortune. We'd been married for 47 years when he died, and I still woke up sometimes expecting to find him beside me. I slipped the photograph into my purse. Whatever else I left behind, I couldn't leave him. As I folded my clothes, I thought about the woman I'd been when Frank was alive. I'd run the church bake sale for 15 years. I'd organized neighborhood block parties and volunteered at the library. I'd hosted Thanksgiving dinner for 20 people without breaking a sweat. When had I become this frightened, diminished version of myself? A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. "Ready, Grandma?" I zipped the suitcase and picked up my purse. "Ready." Ethan took the suitcase and led me quietly through the house. We moved like burglars, which I suppose we were, stealing away my own life in the middle of the night. His car was parked at the end of the driveway, far enough from the house that starting the engine wouldn't wake anyone. As we loaded my meager possessions into his back seat, I caught a glimpse of the porch swing, where Ethan and I had shared so many conversations. Tomorrow, Samantha would probably be relieved to have her perfect outdoor space back to herself. "Second thoughts?" Ethan asked, noticing my hesitation. "No," I said, and meant it. Just saying goodbye. The drive to Mrs. Anderson's house took 20 minutes through empty streets. Ethan had called ahead, and she was waiting on her porch in a flowered robe, her gray hair in curlers. "Virginia Caldwell," she said, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like lavender and vanilla. "It's about time you came to your senses." The guest house was small but charming, clearly decorated by someone who understood that comfort mattered more than fashion. There was a tiny kitchen with cheerful yellow curtains, a bedroom with a quilt that looked like it had been made by loving hands, and a sitting area that looked out over Betty's garden. Real plants grew on the windowsills, not the silk arrangement Samantha preferred, but living things that required attention and care. It was clean and warm, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. More than that, I felt like I could take up space without apologizing for it. "The rent is $50 a week," Betty said, pressing a key into my hand. "And that includes utilities. Don't even think about arguing. Harold left me more money than I know what to do with, and this place was just sitting empty anyway." She showed me how the quirky old stove worked, where she kept the extra blankets, how to adjust the water temperature in the shower. "The phone works if you need to call anyone," she said. "And don't you dare worry about long-distance charges. What's the point of having money if you can't help your friends?" After Ethan left, promising to text me as soon as he knew his parents had discovered my absence, I sat in the little armchair by the window and watched the sun rise over Betty's tomato plants. There was a bird feeder just outside the window, and already cardinals and chickadees were starting their morning routines. I'd forgotten how peaceful it could be to watch birds, to observe the small rituals of creatures who weren't concerned with human drama. "You stay as long as you need," Betty said, pressing a key into my hand. "The rent is whatever you can afford, and if that's nothing for a while, well, the good Lord knows I've got more space than I need." After Ethan left, promising to text me as soon as he knew his parents had discovered my absence, I sat in the little armchair by the window and watched the sun rise over Betty's tomato plants. I felt empty, but it was a clean empty, like a house after a thorough spring cleaning. My phone rang at 8:23 a.m. "Mom?" Paul's voice was tight with panic. "Mom, where are you? Samantha went to check on you this morning and you're not here. Your things are gone." I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head during the sleepless hours before dawn. "I'm somewhere safe, Paul. Don't worry about me." "Don't worry? Mom? What's going on? Did someone take you? Are you hurt?" "No one took me. I left." A long pause. "You left? Mom? That's crazy. Why would you just leave without saying anything?" I closed my eyes, gathering my strength. "Because I heard about the nursing home, Paul. I heard about the bank accounts." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The panic was gone, replaced by something cooler, more calculated. "Mom, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. We've been worried about you living alone, that's all. We just want to make sure you're getting the care you need. The care I need is to be treated like a human being instead of a problem to be solved. That's not fair. We've given you a home for 3 years. You've given me a room. There's a difference." He sighed, and I could picture him rubbing his temples the way he used to when he was a frustrated teenager. "Where are you staying? Let me come pick you up and we'll talk about this properly." "No, Paul, I'm done talking about this. I'm done being talked about like I'm not in the room. I'm done signing papers I don't understand and pretending not to notice when my own contributions are ignored. Mom, you're not being rational. You can't just run away like this. What will people think? There it was, the real concern. Not my well-being, but appearances. What would people think of Paul Linwood, whose elderly mother had fled in the night? They'll think I finally grew a spine, I said, and hung up. The phone rang 6 more times that day. I didn't answer. Over the next few weeks, I began the slow process of reclaiming my life, one small step at a time. Betty drove me to the bank in her ancient Buick, both of us dressed in our Sunday best, because as she put it, banks respect you more when you look like you have your act together. At the bank, I discovered that yes, Samantha had indeed gained access to my accounts through those papers I'd signed. She'd been clever about it, setting herself up as a secondary signer with full access rights. But she hadn't moved quickly enough. Most of my money was still there, and the bank manager, a young woman named Jennifer who reminded me of myself at 30, was horrified when I explained what had nearly happened. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, "I want you to know that what they plan to do constitutes financial elder abuse. You have legal options if you want to pursue them." I thought about that as Jennifer helped me revoke Samantha's authorization and set up new accounts with additional security measures. Legal options. A year ago, the idea would have terrified me. Confrontation had never been my strong suit. But sitting there in the bank, reclaiming my financial independence one signature at a time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anger. Not the hot, destructive kind of anger that makes you say things you can't take back, but the cold, clarifying kind that helps you see exactly what needs to be done. I called a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen, whose office was in a converted Victorian house downtown. Her waiting room was filled with plants and comfortable chairs, and the coffee she offered me was actually good, not the bitter institutional brew I'd expected. Patricia listened to my story with the kind of focused attention I'd forgotten people were capable of. She took notes, asked clarifying questions, and never once suggested that I was overreacting or being too sensitive. "They came very close to succeeding," she told me when I'd finished. "Another week or two, and this could have been much more complicated to untangle. Financial exploitation of elderly people is more common than most families want to admit." She helped me understand what papers I'd signed and what they actually meant. Some were legitimate. Medical directives, emergency contact information, updates to my Medicare records. But others had been more insidious, gradually transferring control of my financial affairs to Paul and Samantha under the guise of helping me manage things better. "The good news," Patricia said, "is that most of the damage is reversible. Your bank accounts are secure now, and we can revoke any powers of attorney you didn't realize you were signing." "Another week or two," Patricia said, "and this could have been much more complicated to untangle." I also discovered something that stunned me. The house Frank and I had shared for 40 years was still technically mine. We'd added Paul to the deed years ago for estate planning purposes, but I was still the primary owner with a 70% stake. I'd assumed he owned it now, that selling it had been his decision to make, but assumptions, I was learning, could be dangerous things. "You have options," Patricia explained, spreading the property documents across her desk. "You could sell it, live in it, rent it out. The choice is entirely yours to make. Your son would need your signature to do anything with the property." The revelation hit me like a physical shock. For 3 years, I'd been living as a guest in Paul's house while my own home sat empty just 20 minutes away. For 3 years, I'd accepted his charity while sitting on assets I didn't even know I controlled. "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Patricia's expression was carefully neutral. "I can't speak to your son's motivations, Mrs. Caldwell, but I can tell you that many adult children make the mistake of thinking they're protecting their parents by managing their affairs without full disclosure." Protection. The word had become suspect, tainted by months of being protected from my own life, my own choices, my own mistakes. I was beginning to understand that sometimes protection was just control wearing a prettier dress. The idea of returning to my old house was both appealing and terrifying. Could I maintain it alone? Could I afford the upkeep? But more importantly, could I handle the memories that lived in every room? Frank had died in our bedroom, in the bed we'd shared for decades. Could I sleep there again without being overwhelmed by grief? But even as I wrestled with these questions, I realized something important had shifted. These were my fears to face, my decisions to make, my risks to take. For the first time in 3 years, I was contemplating my future instead of simply enduring my present. I decided to start smaller. Betty offered me a job helping her with her small catering business. Nothing fancy, just comfort food for church events and family gatherings. It had started as a hobby after her husband Harold died, a way to stay busy and feel useful. But word had gotten around about her legendary potato salad and her ability to feed 50 people without breaking a sweat. And before she knew it, she had more requests than she could handle alone. "I need someone who knows their way around a kitchen," she said over coffee one morning. "Someone who understands that cooking for people is about more than just feeding their bodies. It's about showing you care." The work was perfect for me. Familiar enough to feel comfortable, flexible enough to accommodate my other activities, and meaningful enough to satisfy the part of me that needed to feel useful. My hands remembered the rhythms of cooking for others, the satisfaction of seeing empty plates and hearing satisfied sighs. Slowly, I began to remember who I'd been before I became a burden. The first event was a baby shower for the Methodist Church. 30 women, finger foods and punch, nothing too complicated. But as I stood in Betty's kitchen, arranging deviled eggs on a platter and listening to her chatter about the guest of honor, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: competence. I knew how to do this. I'd done it hundreds of times in my own kitchen, for my own friends and family. My hands moved confidently, arranging food with an eye for both taste and presentation. When we arrived at the church and saw the women's faces light up at the sight of our offerings, I remembered what it felt like to contribute something valuable to the world. "Virginia, these little sandwiches are just perfect," said Mrs. Williams, who'd been on the church hospitality committee for as long as anyone could remember. Where did Betty find such a treasure? A treasure. When was the last time someone had called me that? Ethan visited every week, usually on Sunday afternoons. He'd bring homework sometimes, spreading his textbooks across Betty's kitchen table while I made us grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. We talked about his college applications, his part-time job, his girlfriend Sarah, who wanted to study veterinary medicine. "How are things at home?" I'd ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Tense," he'd say. "Dad keeps asking if I know where you are. Mom goes through phases of being angry and then being worried that people will find out you left. And you? How are you handling it?" He'd shrug, trying to look casual. "I'm fine. It's not like it's a surprise that they're more concerned about appearances than about doing the right thing." But I could see the strain in his face. Living in that house couldn't be easy for him now. Every day, he had to look at his parents and know what they'd been willing to do to his grandmother. One evening in November, he arrived looking particularly troubled. "They're talking about moving," he said without preamble. "Dad got offered a promotion, but it's in Kentucky. They'd leave right after graduation." My heart sank. Ethan was my anchor, my connection to the family I'd lost. If he moved away... "But here's the thing," he continued. "I got into Ohio State, early admission, full academic scholarship." He paused, meeting my eyes. "I could stay, live in the dorms, or Mrs. Anderson says there's a small apartment above the Hendersons' garage. They're looking for a responsible tenant. It's walking distance from the bus line to campus." I understood what he was really saying. He was choosing me over them, choosing to stay in Ohio rather than follow his parents to Kentucky. It was a gift I didn't deserve and couldn't refuse. "Are you sure?" I asked. "College is a time to spread your wings, meet new people. You shouldn't tie yourself down because of me." "I'm not tying myself down. I'm choosing to stay connected to the only family member who's ever treated me like I mattered." By Christmas, the decision was made, though it had taken months of careful consideration. Paul and Samantha would move to Kentucky in June, following his promotion to regional manager at the insurance company where he'd worked for 15 years. It was a good opportunity, he'd explained during one of our awkward phone conversations, a chance to finally get ahead financially. Ethan would stay in Ohio for college, living first in the dorms and then, if things worked out, in the small apartment above the Hendersons' garage. And I would move back into the house Frank and I had built together. The decision hadn't been easy. There were practical concerns. Could I really manage a 3-bedroom house with its large yard and aging systems? There were emotional concerns. Would living surrounded by Frank's memory help me heal or keep me trapped in the past? And there were social concerns. What would people say about a 76-year-old woman living alone in a house too big for one person? But in the end, the deciding factor was simple. It was my house, my choice, my life to live as I saw fit. Betty helped me clean it out and make repairs, turning the project into a social event that drew friends and neighbors I hadn't seen in years. Word had gotten around about my situation. Small towns are terrible at keeping secrets, and people who'd known Frank and me for decades showed up with cleaning supplies and casseroles and an afternoon to spare. "Always like this kitchen," said Tom Henderson, running his hand along the butcher block counters Frank had installed 20 years ago. Frank knew what he was doing when he designed this layout. We discovered that Paul had been using the house as storage, filling the rooms with furniture and belongings he didn't have space for in his own place. Some of it was legitimately his: childhood furniture, sports equipment from his high school years, boxes of photographs and mementos from his wedding. But much of it was just overflow, the inevitable accumulation that comes from having more stuff than space. It took weeks to sort through everything, deciding what was mine, what was his, and what belonged to the house itself. The dining room table where we'd hosted Thanksgiving for 20 years, mine. The china cabinet that had belonged to my grandmother, definitely mine. The exercise bike that had served as a very expensive clothes rack for the past decade, his, and welcome to it. The hardest part was Frank's workshop in the basement. Paul had used it as a dumping ground for Christmas decorations and sporting equipment, but underneath the clutter, everything was exactly as Frank had left it. His tools hung on their designated hooks. His coffee mug sat on the workbench, a ring of ancient coffee stains marking where he'd set it down thousands of times. I sat in his old chair and cried for the first time since the night Ethan had rescued me. Not sad tears exactly, but something more complicated. Grief for the years I'd lost. Relief at being home. Gratitude for the grandson who'd had the courage to wake me up. When Paul and Samantha finally came to collect their belongings from the house, the conversation was stilted and painful, loaded with years of unspoken resentment and disappointment. They brought Ethan with them, perhaps hoping his presence would make me more accommodating, or maybe just because they needed help loading boxes. The house looked different now, cleaner, brighter, more like the home Frank and I had created together. I'd replaced the heavy drapes with simple white curtains that let in more light. The family photos were back on the mantel, including several of Paul as a child that had been packed away in boxes for years. "The house is bigger than you need, Mom," Paul said, looking around the living room where Frank and I had hosted countless family dinners, birthday parties, and Christmas mornings. His voice carried a note of something I couldn't quite identify. Regret, maybe, or envy. "Are you sure you can handle the maintenance?" "I've hired a service for the heavy work," I said, gesturing toward the business card on the coffee table. "And Ethan has offered to help with smaller projects. Plus, Tom Henderson next door has promised to keep an eye on things." Samantha's smile was tight, the kind of expression that looked pleasant from a distance but revealed its artifice up close. "It just seems like a lot of work for someone your age, Virginia. Wouldn't you be more comfortable somewhere with less responsibility? There are some lovely senior communities now." "I'm comfortable with exactly as much responsibility as I choose to take on," I replied, my voice steadier than I'd expected it to be. The words hung in the air between us, carrying weight I hadn't intended but didn't regret. This was new territory for all of us, a version of Virginia Caldwell who spoke her mind clearly and without apology. Paul glanced at Samantha, some wordless communication passing between them. They'd probably discussed this moment, planned their arguments, prepared for my resistance. What they hadn't prepared for was my certainty. There were no apologies, no acknowledgement of what they'd planned to do. But there was a grudging respect in Paul's eyes that hadn't been there before. Perhaps he'd expected me to crumble without their support. Perhaps seeing me standing in my own house, making my own decisions, had reminded him of the woman who'd raised him to be better than he'd become. When they left, Ethan lingered behind. "No regrets?" he asked. "None," I said. "What about you?" He looked around the house, taking in the fresh paint and the family photos I'd rehung in the hallway. "This feels more like home than anywhere I've lived since I was little." And it did. Not the same home it had been when Frank was alive, but something new and different. A place where I could be myself again, where my opinions mattered, where the work of my hands was visible and valued. I started volunteering at the library again, then at the food bank. I rekindled friendships that had languished during my years of exile. I learned to use a computer so I could video call with old friends who'd moved away. I planted a garden and learned to can vegetables like my grandmother had taught me 60 years ago. Some evenings, Ethan would stop by after his classes or his job at the campus bookstore. We'd sit on the porch swing Frank had built, watching the sunset paint the Ohio sky in shades of gold and orange. Sometimes we'd talk about his studies or his plans for the future. Sometimes we'd just sit in comfortable silence, two people who'd saved each other when it mattered most. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" he asked one evening in late spring. "What they did wrong? Maybe. What we did right? Probably not. Does it matter?" I considered the question. 6 months ago, their approval would have mattered enormously. Their disappointment would have crushed me. But sitting there in the swing Frank built, in the yard I'd tended for decades, surrounded by the life I'd reclaimed one small choice at a time, their understanding seemed less important. "It matters that you understand," I said finally. "It matters that I understand. The rest is just noise." As the months passed, I realized something profound had changed in me. I'd spent so much of my life trying to be useful to others, trying to earn my place in the world through service and accommodation. But that night, when Ethan knocked on my door, when he trusted me with the truth and asked me to trust him with my future, I learned something different. Sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to disappear. Sometimes saving yourself is the greatest gift you can give to the people who love you. I still miss the family I thought I had, the son who once called every Sunday, and the daughter-in-law who once smiled genuinely when I walked into a room. But I don't miss the woman I became in their house, small and apologetic and invisible. She's gone, and good riddance. These days, I work part-time at the local bookstore, recommending novels to young mothers and helping elderly customers find large print mysteries. It's not glamorous work, but it's mine. My name is on my paycheck, my opinions matter to my coworkers, and when customers thank me for my help, I know they mean it. Ethan stops by most Sundays, sometimes bringing Sarah or his new friends from college. They sprawl across my living room furniture, eating the cookies I've learned to make from scratch again, debating philosophy and politics, and whether the latest superhero movie was worth the ticket price. Watching them, I remember what it feels like to be surrounded by people who see you as a complete person rather than a collection of needs and inconveniences. They argue with me about politics, ask my advice about relationships, treat my stories about the past as history worth preserving rather than rambling to be endured. "You know what I love about this place?" Sarah said last Sunday, curled up in Frank's old recliner with a cup of tea. "It feels alive, like people actually live here instead of just existing." She was right. The house breathes now in a way it never did during those sterile years when it sat empty. There are books scattered on tables, plants growing on windowsills, music playing from the radio in the kitchen. There's evidence everywhere of a life being actively lived rather than merely survived. Tomorrow is Ethan's 19th birthday, and I'm making his favorite chocolate cake from scratch. 20 people are coming, most of them friends I didn't even know I still had. Betty is bringing her famous potato salad, and Mrs. Henderson from down the street is contributing her homemade rolls. It's the first birthday party I've thrown in over 3 years, the first time I've opened my home to a crowd since Frank died. I'm nervous and excited and proud all at once, the way I used to feel before the big family gatherings I once hosted with such confidence. As I write this, sitting at the kitchen table where Frank and I shared thousands of meals, I can see Ethan's car pulling into the driveway for his weekly visit. He's bringing his laundry, as college students do, and probably hoping for a home-cooked meal and maybe some leftover cookies to take back to his dorm. But more than that, he's coming home to a place where he's wanted, where his stories matter, where the woman who raised his father remembers how to be strong and stubborn and fiercely loving. That night last October, when he knocked on my door and asked me to trust him, I thought he was saving me from them. But I understand now that he was really saving me from myself, from the small, frightened person I'd become, from a life of grateful accommodation and apologetic existence. Sometimes the people who love you most are the ones brave enough to wake you up. Sometimes family isn't about blood or obligation, but about who shows up when everything falls apart. My grandson gave me the courage to save myself, and in doing so, he saved us both. Looking back now, I realize that night in October was the moment I stopped being a victim of my circumstances and became the author of my own story again. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, and there were plenty of moments when I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. But sitting here in my kitchen, watching the morning sun stream through windows I can open whenever I choose, surrounded by the evidence of a life I'm actively choosing to live, I know I made the only decision I could live with. Tomorrow, Ethan starts his sophomore year at Ohio State. He's majoring in social work now, inspired, he says, by watching people navigate systems that aren't always designed to help them. I suspect his experience with me played a role in that choice, though he's too diplomatic to say so directly. Sarah is studying veterinary medicine at Ohio State too, and they're talking about moving in together next summer. They want to find a little house with a yard where Sarah can foster rescue dogs while she finishes school. The idea makes me smile. Two young people building a life around the idea of giving abandoned creatures a second chance. As for Paul and Samantha, they've settled into their new life in Kentucky. Paul calls every few weeks. Our conversations polite but distant, like acquaintances catching up rather than family staying connected. He seems genuinely surprised that I've thrived on my own, and I sometimes catch a note of something like pride in his voice when he tells his friends about his independent mother who moved back into her own house and started her own business. Samantha sends Christmas cards with long, chatty letters about their new friends and Paul's success at work. She never mentions the nursing home, never acknowledges what they plan to do. But she always includes a line about how glad she is that I'm doing so well on my own, as if my happiness validates their decision to leave. Maybe it does. Maybe we all got what we needed in the end. My independence, their freedom from responsibility, Ethan's education in standing up for what's right. But on quiet Sunday afternoons, when Ethan stops by with his homework, and Sarah brings fresh flowers from the farmer's market, I'm reminded that family isn't just about blood relations or legal obligations. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart, who tells you the truth when everyone else chooses comfortable lies, who believes in your strength even when you've forgotten you have any. That night last October, when a 17-year-old boy knocked on my bedroom door and asked me to trust him with my future, I learned that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones brave enough to wake you up. Sometimes saving yourself is the greatest gift you can give to the people who refuse to let you disappear. Today is a good day. They all are now.